Good evening, everybody. It's absolutely wonderful to see a packed lecture theatre here tonight. My name's Charlie Jeffrey. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the University of York, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all and to this wonderful panel of speakers to celebrate the opening of David Kato College. Before we get going, I have to point out the slide behind me to you, which gives you information about what you need to do in the event of an emergency, and we are not expecting a fire alarm. So if one should sound, people will give you advice about where to go, but broadly speaking, head to the exits. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to our panel chair, David Hickman. Before that, I just wanted to say a very brief few words to reflect how important it is that the university's 11th college has been named in honour of David Kato. David Kato was a human rights defender and gay rights activist who had been a protective fellow on the Human Rights Defenders Programme at the Centre for Applied Human Rights at the university, in the early stages of a programme which has now seen about 100 human rights defenders from around about 50 countries spend time here at the university. Now, as a university of sanctuary and a city of sanctuary, we pride ourselves on offering a welcoming and safe place for refugees, asylum seekers, and other people who have been forced to leave their home. And I'm really proud of that about this university. But for me, this is not and cannot simply be about offering support to those in need, however crucial that is, but we also need to take the opportunity to learn from them, to infuse our research and teaching with what we learn, and to inform our actions with what we learn. And I see that true reciprocity in the relationship we have with the human rights defenders we are privileged to host. And I think we can say the same about David Kato. We've learnt a lot from his period here. That period here at the University of York provided, sadly, all too brief respite from David's role in Uganda as a human rights activist. And his legacy supports now the continued commitment of the university to the LGBT community. As you may know, there's a wonderful information board in the exhibition outside. David was tragically murdered in Kampala in 2011, weeks after winning a court victory over a tabloid paper that called for homosexuals to be killed. Now, we'll hear more reflections about David after the panel discussion from one of his colleagues at the Centre for Applied Human Rights, Joanna Chismas. We're looking forward to that. David is an inspiring role model for our students, and in naming the college after him, and I should say our students played a key role in that naming. We had a number of names that were kind of in the frame, but that was the one that our students really plumped for. In naming the college after him, we also reflect our belief and our commitment to equality, diversity and inclusion. But we also symbolise with that naming our admiration of and solidarity with human rights defenders across the world. That's central to our vision and commitment to be a university for public good. Some of you may not yet have experienced the college. It's just a little way away from where we are now. It's now home to 800 students. It's been designed to connect with the beautiful landscape around it, and in particular the lake, which laps at the edges of it. And we've been very careful to think hard about the ecological diversity around the building. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank those involved in the process of building our recognition of David Kato. There are too many of them to name in person, but let me just mention Equitix, Graham Construction, many colleagues from our Department of Technology, Estates and Facilities, our Finance Department, and Professor Ambrose Field, who chaired the project board, much of which chairing was done during COVID, so it wasn't entirely straightforward. So, to tonight's event, I'm delighted to welcome our panel of expert speakers who will be reflecting on some of the ways in which we might tackle challenges to human rights collectively by enhancing awareness and activism through our work in universities, through art, through broadcasting, and through filmmaking. It will, I'm sure, be a fascinating discussion. And I'm just going to introduce now our chair who will guide it, documentary filmmaker David Hickman. David is a former member of staff at what we are now calling the School of Arts and Creative Technologies. It was something else in your time. And is a current associate of the Centre for Applied Human Rights. His recent documentary work has explored human rights and related questions in the US, the Caribbean, and South Asia. David, over to you. Thank you very much.
And thank you, and thank you for coming and making us feel a little bit like rock stars. This is a fantastic turnout. And we've got quite the topical week, I think, to be talking about human rights. It's somewhat unexpectedly made topical by a sports presenter. But it's highlighted something which has happened in a rather topical way because of what's going through Parliament right now. Nick Cohen, the commentator, wrote an article last week saying that this is the first time in 2 centuries that a British Prime Minister has been anti-slavery. And that's quite something. It certainly wasn't, but it certainly wasn't on my bingo card that Gary Lineker would provoke a reaction to this. Now, in this discussion, we're going to take a particular focus on the whole question of human rights and sort of be guided by the title of it, which is The Future of Human Rights, Research, Activism, Sanctuary, and Storytelling. And I suspect what we will discuss not so much are the traditional areas of human rights discussions, which, to do with conventions and those kinds of things, and more to do with practical things. Hence the presence, which would have been unthinkable, I think, a few years ago, the presence of a subject like storytelling, thinking about how we tell stories in human rights. Now, I'd like quickly to introduce everyone. I'm going to do it alphabetically to avoid any arguments and controversy. On my far right is Fauzia Ihsani, who is presently a PhD student here in the Department of Politics at the University of York. And I think the subject is, I made a note of it, it's the efficiency of regional and international organizations after 2001. I guess there's also now an end point for your research, given what's happened in the last year. But you were before that a deputy minister in the transport ministry, and an advisor, senior advisor to the High Council for National Reconciliation.
Yes.
Again, a post-2001 organization, I assume.
Exactly.
And Paul, to my immediate right is Paul Greedy, an old friend of mine. Paul is the co-director of the Centre for Applied Human Rights, so it's very much at the centre of the story of York's involvement in the whole human rights question. He's worked for Amnesty International, a number of other human rights organizations. He also works, I think, as a consultant from time to time. Mm-hmm. And presently focusing research on issues like transitional justice, which I find fascinating, which has a lot, I think, to do with your South African work. And the place of universities as places of activism and the protection of human rights and human rights people, human rights defenders. I'm sorry, Mirta, I've not got a very good, my writing is horrible and I've messed up your surname. What is your?
Just call me Mirta.
Okay, I'll just call you Mirta then. Mirta is the chief of section for media development and media in emergency at UNESCO, with a particular interest in, as I understand it, communication and the flow of communication, the problems of communication, particularly in the broadcast sectors. And we know from experience, one or two of us up here, that what the problems are in rather practical ways. We go live now to Frank Mugisha. Hello, Frank, can you hear me? Very good. Frank is a Ugandan LGBTQ advocate. He's executive director of Sexual Minorities Uganda. He's won the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Award and the Thorolf Rafto Memorial Prize. Rafto was, I think, a Norwegian human rights advocate. And was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2014. And finally, to my immediate left is Karim Shah, an Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker working in current affairs as well as in observational documentary filmmaking, and having worked in a variety of pretty far-flung, dangerous places, like Pyongyang in North Korea, Sierra Leone, and Timbuktu. I'm not sure whether it was controversial then, but it was it?
Yeah, we'll have to leave. I quite.
Oh well, it was controversial then, so I was right to guess that it might be. Okay, so what we do now is I'm just going to go speaker by speaker, starting with Mirta, to give us a kind of 5-minute overview each of what their interest and field of activity is. And Mirta, I know that you want to talk a little bit about communications and broadcast and how this intersects with human rights at UNESCO itself. Over to you.
Thank you. Well, first and foremost, thank you for inviting UNESCO. It's a great honor to be here. UNESCO is the United Nations Agency for Education, Science, and Culture. And human rights lies at our heart from the beginning when they were conceived to today, where every single of our sectors is dedicated to the defense of a human right, whether it is education or cultural diversity or even the rights of scientists and so on and so forth. But today I would like to gather to think a bit about how we understand two rights which are very much challenged in today's world, which are the rights to information and to freedom of expression. And how we understand them, it's very important for afterwards how we safeguard them. And the corollary of these two rights is actually press freedom, that every country will enjoy free, independent, and pluralistic media. And we need this type of media because they are the ones that will actually guarantee that we will access verified information and that we will have a channel to express our opinions and our views in a democratic way. So the first thing I would like to remind you is that media has traditionally actually evolved in a positive way, has become more and more less of a state media. If we think of the centuries ago and decades ago. But today, the model under which journalism has been conceived, which is supported by advertising and by public funding, this model is not working anymore. Advertising has mostly gone to online media or to internet or social media, and in many countries, public funding for media is being cut. So this has put media in a very important crisis of survival, and they have been forced to reduce staff and to rethink programming, and then to go online. And online, we have the second challenge, which is the abundance of content. And the fact that not all the content that is online is really what we would call information or what we would call news. But people presently sometimes prefer to get informed by what they are getting feed online than really going to what would be traditional media. At the same time, there are factors that influence the independence of media, because for media to help us get impartial information, we need them to be independent. And if they are financially dependent because of all this context that I have just explained, then we are risking that they will be editorially independent, that is, independent in their programming and independent in their content, and also able to vehicle the diversity of opinions that normally exist in a society. So far we are good? Yes? Okay. So when it comes to, let's say, the other phase of freedom of expression, which would be access to information, we have the online platforms, but they also run through algorithms, as you for sure know. And these algorithms puts us in an informational bubble or disinformational bubble. Each one of us lives in one little bubble, which is different between us, but it's the bubble that is created by the algorithms because of the websites we visit, the information we get, and so on. So we are not really in the situation where we have true access to the whole variety of news that may possibly be affecting our lives. This impartiality I mentioned, and verification of news, is something that is missing in social media, and is something that professional media, whether public service, but also normally private broadcasters, they do automatically, and it's very costly. We only see the host of a radio program, of a TV program, or we listen to a host on radio, and we don't see the team behind that every single thing they have said has been verified. The facts, the analysis, the statistics they are giving, the fact they are giving the word to different and opposing views, all this is very costly for a media. So maybe because we only have 5 minutes, I just would like to say that this professional media serves a public function, which is providing us with the information that is of public interest, of interest to us, and that allows us in our daily life to make what we call informed decisions. And if media is not functioning because of all these factors that I mentioned, then we are really in a situation where these two basic rights, access to information and freedom of expression, are being challenged. Maybe I stop here?
You can stop there. We can introduce other elements of what you might have planned to say into the general discussion, if that's all right.
Now? No?
Well, how much? Well, no, go on a little
okay.
bit. Go on a little bit longer. That's
A
all
bit
right.
more?
Yeah.
Okay. I hope I'm not boring you. And apologies for my accent. My children are always, criticizing me because of my lack of English accent. They are teenagers, so they are very hard on me. So I was saying we need this professional media is the one holding the powerful to account. That's why we need them. They are the ones who hold the checks and balances in society, and the ones that, in that sense, are protecting all the human rights, the variety of them. What I would like to highlight would be also us as consumers of news and of content. Everything circulating in social media, I call it content. I don't call it information because it's not necessarily information, has not been verified and all this, that we want to be sure about. The fact that we have freedom of expression, that we have a right, and that we now have more opportunities to say what we think thanks to social media, which is a positive, actually, evolution in my view, that doesn't give us carte blanche to say whatever and however. Because the human rights, they are indivisible. It's not that one right is higher than the other right. The right to religion, freedom of religion, is not more, neither less important than freedom of expression or the right to education. They are indivisible. They have been conceived in an indivisible way. So the fact that I have a right to freedom of expression does not give me, let's say, the carte blanche, I don't have another term, to go and say unverified things or insult or offend or use the internet to harm others. That's maybe the difficulty sometimes and what we still have to learn as a society, to use internet in a way that will not harm the others and that will not harm ourselves as well. We have to retain that these 5 big companies that govern social media are private companies. They don't have human rights in their objectives. They don't have democracy or the rule of governance as their aim. They are for-profit companies. So we need perhaps a bit more of media and information literacy so that every single citizen will be empowered to use social media, but not disqualify or disregard traditional media for that sense. Because nowadays, many persons, they will refuse to pay the €1 per month to read a newspaper online because they think, why will I pay if I can get free information through social media? But actually, you're not getting the same quality of information. So part of media and information literacy has to be to help people value quality information that comes from quality journalism. So this is more or less what I wanted to say.
Okay, we'll come back to you when the discussion opens up. Thank you very much. Paul, sort of continuing on with some of these themes in a way, academia has, I presume you would argue, a rather important role to play in the whole human rights discussion, particularly with regard to thinking about collaborations, thinking about communication, and these kinds of issues that Mirta has been talking about, really.
Yes. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to be here today, and looking around the room, I see a lot of familiar faces, people who've supported our center in a range of different ways for many years. So a great pleasure to welcome you all. I don't normally write out my talks word for word, but this one felt too important not to. Attempts to reimagine the future, including the future of human rights, are very much in vogue. This is in part because of a set of interlinked crises, COVID-19 and its legacies, climate change, the rise of populism and democratic backsliding, austerity and inequality. All these have raised questions about whether our current economic and political systems and structures are fit for purpose. A pervasive sense of unease has also affected the human rights movement and the social justice sectors more generally. Frequently, it feels as though we in the human rights movement march to the top of the campaigning or advocacy hill, only to look round and find that no one is following us. Why is this? Drawing on the work that the Center for Applied Human Rights has done over the last 15 years, I want to suggest that 3 things are key to the future of human rights: collaborations and new forms of collaborative working, thinking seriously about communication and the ability to communicate in different registers to different audiences, and finally, rediscovering our capacity to dream. Let me start with collaboration. This panel, actually, in its composition, is a great example, I think, of the different perspectives we need to advance human rights. Our centre has championed collaboration in various ways. First, I would say that our main collaborators are human rights defenders, frontline activists who come to York on our protective fellowship scheme for human rights defenders at risk. Over time, we've integrated human rights defenders into our teaching and our research, and I hope adapted our teaching and research to what we have learned from them. Our fellows are our guides as we seek to move between the high ground of the university and the swamp, or the complexity of the real world. On the high ground, in lecture theatres like this, problems can seem manageable, amenable to theoretical or technical solutions. The swamp is the real world, where reality is messy and people need to know how to deal with uncertainty, complexity, and value conflict. This collaboration is the heartbeat of all that we do, whether it be research on ways to enhance safety and security for defenders, or seeking to design an applied pedagogy for our students, with human rights defenders through all of this providing our grounding and our inspiration. A second related example is that CAR champions collaboration by providing a platform for diverse actors to meet. Our work routinely engages with NGOs and social movements, think tanks, artists, donors, governments, and intergovernmental agencies. The new UNESCO chair that we've launched in a workshop over the last 2 days looks at the role universities can play in protecting activists and civil society and enhancing political space and democracy. It's underpinned by a network of universities and civil society partners. UNESCO asks that its chairs provide a bridge, or bridge builders between different stakeholders. They want the chairs to be future-oriented and laboratories of ideas. The remit of these chairs aligns very well, I think, to the way that we usually hope to work within the centre and with the focus of this panel today. So the future is collaborative. We need to be innovative bridge builders, in our case, between the university and the external world, across professional sectors, and more, and adept at managing complex relationships and coalitions. Let me move on to communication. One of the hard learning points for me from our human rights work in York, in 2017, York became the UK's first human rights city, is that I'm regularly told that I sound like an academic, even when I make an effort not to. When I try to adjust what I say for a public audience, I'm not easy to understand, apparently. We are products of our backgrounds and professions. We simply don't realize how we sound to others. If academics rarely miss an opportunity to make a simple idea as complicated as possible, those working in human rights quickly become embedded in a technical, professionalized legal language designed to speak truth to the state or to power, not to speak truths to members of the public. I am lucky enough to be both an academic and work in human rights. Frankly, it's a wonder anyone understands a word that I say. Research that Emma Jackson and I conducted for the working paper used in the launch of the UNESCO chair found that people in universities use a different vocabulary to the one used in human rights organizations, even when working on social justice. Terms like human rights and protection are not widely used or understood in universities. That said, there are concepts and initiatives that provide an entry point. The Sustainable Development Goals, a focus on internationalization and an impact. At York, a commitment to be a university of the public good. With respect to our UNESCO chair, for communication between universities and civil society to be effective, we will need to translate between different languages or registers, and to develop an ability for people to make their values legible in languages used by others. The second example is in our work in York. It very quickly became clear that simply enunciating human rights principles and laws as if they're self-evidently correct and applicable, and expecting everyone to act accordingly, doesn't get you very far. We've learned that different forms of argumentation are needed. Moral and legal, to be sure, but also evidence and effectiveness-based, for example. In crowded and complex policy contexts, people need to know why human rights matter and will make a difference. This often means engaging in persuasion. Proclaiming laws and principles is not enough. So secondly, the future requires that we communicate better. We need to be able to communicate in different ways to different audiences, to translate between professional and institutional languages and settings, to be experts in making ourselves legible to others, in being persuasive. If the future is an argument, how do we ensure that human rights is part of the debate? Our final point is that we need to rediscover our capacity to dream. At its core, the message of human rights is very simple. It is that every human being has inherent dignity and is of equal value. Beyond the individual, it also suggests how we should relate to one another. The concept of Ubuntu, made famous by Archbishop Desmond Tutu when he headed the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, captures this component of human rights extremely well. I am human because you are human. If I violate or denigrate your humanity, I cause harm not only to you, but also to myself. Or to put it the other way around, I am only fully human if you are fully human too. We live interconnected lives, so we need both individual and collective dreams. At the start of my professional career, I was lucky enough to experience two moments when advances in human rights and an enhanced capacity to dream chimed. Before and after South Africa's first democratic election in 1994, negotiations to establish a new human rights-based constitution provided a key component for a vision for a new South Africa, in part because liberation movements had never completely given up on the law, tarnished though it was, as a route to justice under apartheid. The law was considered a possible tool for transformation in its aftermath. In 1998, I celebrated the passing of the Human Rights Act in the UK, in parties across North London, in a manner that I suspect would be banned in our house now by my son, as including inexcusable outbreaks of dad dancing. If the promise of these moments has not been fully realized, it does not eradicate the importance of dream events or moments when we reconsider what is possible and dare to reach for the previously impossible. More broadly, for human rights to be part of rediscovering our capacity to dream means several things. Human rights work mostly focuses on documenting violence and violations, on critique and holding to account. This is necessary work, but it is not the stuff of dreams. Alongside these activities, we need to celebrate victories and advances, however small, to articulate what we are for as well as what we are against, and to develop broader visions. Perhaps one function of our protective fellowship scheme for human rights defenders is to provide frontline activists with a space to dream. A space where people can sleep through the night because they are no longer fearful of a knock on their door and have time to reflect on what appears impossible today but may become possible tomorrow. To conclude, tonight we're doing several things. We're celebrating the opening of David Kato College, a college named not after a famous politician, an eminent business person, or a cultural icon, but after a human rights defender. Generations of students will pass through the college. They will learn of his life and extraordinary bravery as a gay rights activist, and they will carry his example to all parts of the world. My colleague and fellow co-director, Joanna Chismas, will say more about David later in the evening. We're launching a UNESCO chair, which opens a new chapter in the work of our centre and its partners to support human rights defenders and strong civil societies and democracies. We're launching the Sanctuary Fund, which will help scholars at risk, human rights defenders, and asylum seekers and refugees to secure access to the university. And we're doing all of this in the University of York's 60th year and our centre's 15th year. So, perhaps today is our own event or moment here at the University of York when we renew our commitment to a values-based future, a future where we place human rights at the heart of our individual and collective capacity to dream.
Thank you, Paul. And to continue the theme a little bit with some practical input, I thought we might talk to Frank now. Frank, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
My understanding is that you want to talk about LGBTQ rights in Uganda, but also a little bit about the presence and effect of religious extremist groups in the country as well.
Yes.
Over to you.
Well, thank you so much, and good evening, everyone from Kampala. As introduced, my name is Frank Mugisha. I'm here in Uganda right now. I am the Executive Director of Sexual Minorities in Uganda, and it is such an honor to be here, but also to celebrate David Kato College. So Sexual Minorities in Uganda, we do advocacy, we do research and documentation, we also do safety and protection. So our advocacy is around Africa and Uganda, but we also do international advocacy for LGBTQ rights. But this evening, I thought I would speak more around the work we do around safety and protection. So as some of you will know, that Uganda is one of the countries in Africa that still criminalizes same-sex acts. And the criminalization is up to life in prison. Unfortunately, these are laws that were introduced and left behind by the British colonialists. But that said, Uganda has continuously tried to introduce more extreme legislations. For instance, as we speak now, Uganda is in our parliament considering a legislation that would make it illegal to identify as LGBTQ, just by identifying as LGBTQ. In 2009, Uganda tried to introduce an anti-gay legislation that had a death penalty for LGBTQ persons. So when these legislations and members of parliament and government bring them up, the propaganda, the media that follows these legislations, in many times contributes to the harassment and the violations of LGBTQ persons. My colleague David, who I worked with every day here in Uganda, was murdered, was, together with my other colleagues and myself, challenged a newspaper that was outing people against just in parliament. And after that, he was murdered at his house. A very scary moment for community members here in Uganda, including myself. We are seeing a repeat of the same happening at this moment. I live constantly in fear. I move from house to house. Places where I can't be found or traced. I constantly receive death threats to my life. Violence, just in a period of 1 month, we have recorded 110 cases of violations towards the LGBT community, including extreme violations. So this hasn't changed. But this evening, we're talking about storytelling, remembering the legacy and the life of my colleague and my very good friend, David Kato, who I spent years working with here in Uganda. And the story I wanted to tell you today is how much David's work, my work, and the work of many brilliant and very resilient activists on the ground here in Kampala is saving lives of many queer persons who cannot, one, speak up, two, express themselves, who cannot be open about their sexuality because of fear of what society will do to them. David lived his life defending and speaking up for queer persons here in Uganda. And for me, this work is very difficult, but also it causes a lot of mental health and trauma to the individual doing this work. So one day, David came to my house, and he found I had so many padlocks and chains on my door. And I had lights under my bed. And he asked me, Frank, what's going on? He cared so much about us. And he cared about our security. So he said, what's going on? Why do you have all these things on your door? And I was like, because I'm worried someone could break in and kill me. Or something could happen to me. And the next day, he spent 3 days working and finding me a therapist to support me with my mental health, because he felt like I needed it. So he lived a life not only defending the rights of LGBTQ persons, but caring about the activists and the well-being of activists all around the world. So it gives me so much honor and privilege to be speaking to you from Kampala tonight, amidst the worst periods we're going through. It is part of the worst moments that we're going through now. A lot of violence toward the community. You know, I am working almost 24 hours, receiving cases, having to go to parliament, having to do a lot of things. So it is one of those times in Uganda right now where the situation for the LGBT community is not good. So thank you so much. And I'm wishing you all a very good evening in the UK. And I can add on that David loved York University. We spoke every time he was there. In fact, I was helping him do the application. He was doing it to come to York University. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Frank. We had a slightly sketchy connection, but that was a very beautiful contribution. I'm going to come next to a filmmaker, Kareem, who's going to talk about two rather difficult subjects for filmmakers who work in this field. One is to do with impact, and the other is to do, I guess, with authorship in a broader sense.
Yeah.
Does that sound right?
I
Okay.
changed it.
Yes.
But yeah, I'm a documentary filmmaker. I'm like a regular jobbing filmmaker.
I make films for all the major broadcasters in the UK and internationally, for Al Jazeera English, PBS Frontline, BBC World Service. And I suppose, I've made films in over 30 countries. And the job's a real privilege. I see a lot of the world, but you see a lot of bad parts of the world as well. Yet at the same time, especially in terms of human rights defenders, I've met some just amazing people in my career, and it's those people that really kind of inspire me and make me do what I do. The last film I made was shot in Afghanistan. It's called No Country for Women, and it was shot just after the Taliban came into power in like October. Over 5 months, went back to England, then came back to Afghanistan, finished this time last year. And it's about the treatment of women in Afghanistan by the Taliban. And especially we concentrated on the provinces, because there were less foreign journalists going to the provinces. Everyone was kind of concentrating on Kabul and taking like selfies with the Taliban and stuff, And there were less journalists, Afghan journalists, working in the provinces because many had fled. So that's what we concentrated on. One of the key kind of scenes in the film is shot in Herat prison, Herat women's prison. But the reporter I worked with is of Iranian descent but speaks fluent Dari, so we could kind of pose as like a couple and travel around like inconspicuously. But anyway, in the prison, so it's a long story, but we managed to film covertly inside the prison, and we find dozens of women who are incarcerated for immorality. And although immorality was illegal, however it's defined from the previous government as well, but people weren't locked up. And what we found was that these women were locked up and there was no record of their arrest. So there was no recourse for justice for these women. But why I mention it is I think in terms of investigating human rights abuses, it sounds obvious, but what's really important is detail. And especially in places where you have like a kind of a well-known, like a blanket like bad guy, like the Taliban or the Syrian regime or the Burmese junta. It's almost easy to kind of like pass the buck because it's just like it's that big homogenous, that big body, and they did it. And I think what I'm particularly interested in the moment is trying to identify exactly who is doing stuff. Like who is that Talib? Who does he work for? I mean, say a film I'd love to make now, which I'm not doing, but would be maybe something in Iran, looking at the protesters who were being killed, who pulled the trigger, who was their boss. And I think it's that like identifying a perpetrator is like that's like the road to accountability. So that's what I'm interested in working on at the moment. But I'm very proud of my last film, No Country for Women, because it had a very tangible impact. Because especially in the US, where a lot of policymakers saw it and used it, and it's been used in a few asylum cases. Although I've got to say that the amount of women granted asylum in the US is like abysmal. It's really disgraceful. And the film's also being used in a legal case against the Taliban as well, which I can't say too much about at the moment. But it felt really good seeing one of my films actually being put to use, because I'd say the vast majority of the films that I've made, it's really hard to quantify, like what the impact's actually been. And I think especially because most of those films are never shown in the countries where I've actually shot them. And so I'm often kind of like racking my brains at how do you get more impact out of films? And there are things you can do, like you can get like an impact producer, work out a plan for like post-TX. But that takes money, first off, in budgets which are already getting like smaller and smaller. And also, as a freelancer, I'll finish one job in Mexico and then I've got to go to Ukraine the next week. So you're not like, you can't always continue that rollout. So yeah, it's a big problem, I think, like trying to squeeze impact out of films, and would depend on partners. It would depend on UN organisations or other like NGOs to try and like do that heavy lifting for us when it comes to like rollouts and impact. But I'd like to talk about one series that I have been working for recently at the BBC. It's a series called Africa Eye, and I think they're doing it like they have a really smart model. I don't know if you're familiar with the series, but they're investigative films from all around Africa, and a key kind of like a key thing that they do is they partner with a local channel. So if you make a film in Kenya, it'll go out on the world service, but then it'll go out on a Kenyan channel as well, and so the people who the film's about are actually watching the film as well. And I've got a friend who's at, the unit's been going for like 5 years now, and I have a friend there who's one of the exec producers, and he's like 30 years at the BBC, and he said he reckons he's made more change in that 5 years than he's done at like 30 years at Panorama. And another really special thing about Africa Eye is they're using more and more local producers and directors, and I think this is like it's still not enough. There's still a long way to go, but I think that's really key in terms of. You can fly people like me. I sound like I'm kind of doing myself out of a job, but you can fly people like me into places. But I'm never going to know a story as much as like someone in Uganda who like lives and breathes that story, and as much as they know it, and stand out. I can't get that kind of access. So I think by using local people and investing in them, we're going to get like truer, better journalism, better films. But that does take investment, and it's not that. If we use Africa as a continent as an example, it's not because the quality's not there, but there's not like if you're in Uganda, there's not like a regular dispatches program or a Panorama which you've grown up with where you can like target and like pitch things to. So it's good that the BBC put platforms out there like Africa Eye where people you can know like I've got an investigation about a hospital in Kampala. It can go on that platform. Otherwise, like where does it go? Yeah, but I suppose just to finish up. I imagine you have the same thing as well. Like I have this constant battle. Like the films that I'm making, are they actually doing any good? And especially, I think since probably the Syrian conflict, which really like brought this home to me. And in fact, I talked to a friend in Syria last night. She was in Afrin, dealing with the earthquake there, like awful situation. But we met in 2012. And at that time, people were so happy to see us there. Everyone wanted to talk to camera and stuff because they really thought, okay, the international media is here, it's going to affect change. And then I remember this same woman, by like 2014, she was like, why are you bothering? The country where you're from has done nothing about this. There's no fly zone. It hasn't made any difference at all. And I find that really hard, But then at the same time, there's films like that film in Karachi that we're talking about. I made a film about water scarcity in Karachi in 2016, and there's a guy watched the film here in the UK, I think he like owns a restaurant or something. Anyway, he got in touch with us through the production company, and he wanted to get in touch with one of the people featured in the film, which is a family who had a poor family who had a disabled daughter, and she had a condition where she would soil herself like regularly throughout the day, and the cost of water was so high in her neighbourhood, it was cheaper for the mother to buy second-hand clothes from the market than buy water to wash her daughter with. So this guy, this film was made in 2016, every month he sends money to Karachi, hire the local producer, she picks the money up, drives, Karachi's 20 million people, massive city, she drives across the city 2 hours every month and gives those people, that family, that money. And I see that email between them every month for the past 7 years, and that it makes me think that even in unexpected areas, the things that these films that we make can do a lot of good. Yeah.
Yes, and I suspect there's something else that happens which maybe we don't see initially, which is that when we go make films, there is a tendency now that the media landscape has changed for people to want to pick up their own cameras and do things. And so in a way, what often happens, I get a lot of curiosity from people I make films about. And they ask me really quite detailed technical things, for example, but they're also thinking about the sorts of stories they want to tell.
Yeah.
And I suspect there is a lingering impact that we don't see.
Yeah.
When we go and make films. I hope there is, but I've seen one or two examples of it. And perhaps what we should be thinking of is regularizing that a little bit and thinking about how we can impart knowledge about how films are made and be more open about the process of how we make films and how we tell stories in the human rights field in particular, because we're talking to vulnerable people most of the time.
Yeah.
But I do detect a small change. So I think there's reason for optimism in that.
Oh, I'm optimistic. I'm still here doing it.
Yes. And you've been talking quite a bit about Afghanistan. We're going to finish with Fauzia, who is going to talk, to some degree at least, about your own experience in escaping what we know to be a dreadful situation. But you can do it from being there, which I can barely imagine.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm very pleased to be here and have the opportunity to speak about women's situation in Afghanistan and also share my personal experience and personal story. Actually, my story resembles thousands of other Afghan women who faced a challenging time defying numerous hindrances. Many of you may recall the Bonn Conference 2001, which recommended the establishment of Afghan Independent Commission for Human Rights to oversee and defend human rights in a farther and closer look to women's rights in Afghanistan. This was not the only institutions to work for women's rights in Afghanistan. We had the Ministry of Women's Affairs and many other national and international organizations were working on reporting and documenting human rights, especially women's rights violations. In addition to it, in 2020, Afghanistan officially established the Commission of Afghanistan Human Rights Defenders after several life-taking incidents in Afghanistan. You can't believe what happened when the Afghanistan's fall to the hand of the Taliban on August 15, 2021. The Taliban dismissed the Ministry of Women's Affairs in the first move, and Independent Human Rights Commission, and then they forced the other human rights activities organization to leave the country. This, in fact, contributed to underreporting the violation of women's rights, restrictions on women movements, and in many places, family-related violation. Today, as I'm speaking to you, there are no organizations in Afghanistan to make sure that even the basic human rights are preserved and defend the right of women, namely access to education, access to work, presence in business activity, and presence in decision-making layers. In today's Afghanistan, women are more vulnerable than at any other time in past. Despite challenges, they are the only group at the forefront of the struggles for freedom and democracy. They not only fight for their rights, but also the freedom that is necessary for every human. When the Taliban took power in Afghanistan, in their first move, they banned girls of medium and high school from attending their schools, and after 1 year, from attending to university. They dismissed all women civil servants and continued restrictions on women. Additionally, they stoned several women to death for alleged crimes that have never been transparently and justly processed. But the right to education was always a challenge for Afghan girls. Many years ago, we were first forced to escape the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. And my mom was a single mom with children who was deprived from education. But she worked hard and had to put all her efforts and resources to educate me and my other sisters and brothers. And beside us, she started going to adult school to be literate. And now she is a literate woman who is very active on social media as well. She has Instagram, she has Facebook, and she's very, very active on the social media, and I'm very, very proud of her. My sister was the first girl in our family, and relatives were admitted to the university. I can remember that it was not easy for my mom to convince all the male family members to allow my sister to go to university. And when I started my first master's degree, she stood against all male again to allow me to pursue my master's degree. And I believe my mom was the first human rights defenders that I see in my life. She sacrificed her life for her children's education. And I know very well how human rights defenders play a crucial role in the world. Finally, I commend the decision of the university to establish a department under the name of David Kato, who sacrificed his life in defending human rights. And I'm sure he will always be remembered. Thank you very much.
Now, I was going to ask a few questions of each of the panel, but we're running a bit late because of delays at the beginning. So I thought I might take a risk and go straight to Q&As from the audience. Just the guys at the top, do you need the microphone back for that? Oh, you don't? Okay. So does anyone have a question?
I guess it's a question that anyone could answer, but I think you all kind of touched upon the importance of getting people involved in countries with human rights violations and anywhere where there are human rights violations, getting people involved in speaking about their experiences and in playing a part in tackling violations. But I guess with the dangers that they face in doing so, how can people kind of feel empowered and supported in doing so? And how can we play a part in supporting them in doing so, is my question.
Thank you. Paul, do you want to address that about how people are supported?
I can make a start. I mean, it's very difficult, is the honest answer to that. But there is now lots of support, I guess, that can be provided for human rights, people who want to get involved in human rights around protection and security. So physical security, online security, these sorts of things. There's far more training and support available around those kinds of things, which are never absolutely foolproof. Clearly, there will still be dangers involved in the work. But so that, I mean, I guess that's one area where there is support, and that kind of support can be provided locally or it can be provided internationally. So there are NGOs whose role really is to provide exactly that kind of support. So I guess that's the main thing that I would say is that I mean, you're never going to get over the fact that there's risk attached to this kind of work, but it can be mediated in certain ways. And I mean, I suppose in a way our fellowship scheme is part of a wider infrastructure of another kind of support, which is around, I mean, people can be moved within a country, for example, to places where it's safe, or they can be taken out of the country, which is what our fellowship scheme does. Now that is a short-term measure, but those kinds of relocations and placements can also be an opportunity to build capacity for respite, for training around security and so on, that allows people to go back better equipped to do the kind of work that they need to do.
Thank you. And Frank, if you can hear me, I wonder if you could comment on this, because I noticed that, I mean, given your awards, which are extraordinarily prestigious, did they give you any sort of protection, support in what you do?
Well, thank you so much. So I wanted to say that part of the protection is by recognizing human rights defenders and amplifying their voices. Because many people ask me, then how are you going to survive and live in Uganda? Because of my international recognition, so sometimes the Ugandan government, that gives me a shield and security from the government. But of course, it doesn't protect me from the public and the overzealous law enforcement, but then it gives me a bit of protection to be able to speak out in public, one, but also to be able to access prisons and police stations and support individual LGBT persons who are arrested. So amplifying the voices of activists on the ground. But the other part could be reaching out directly to activists because they know how you can support them. So if you know any activists that you see on social media, you can reach out directly to them and ask them, how can I support you? But also joining support groups and signing petitions, because it is good, for instance, for our issues in Uganda. It is good when we see that the international community cares and they are concerned about the LGBTQ lives of LGBTQ persons in the global south.
Thank you, Frank. And Fawzia, could I just ask you, given the situation of women in Afghanistan, how does support even work? I mean, is it possible?
I think the only thing that I always think about it is that people can raise their voice and share some news about the women's situation in Afghanistan, because I'm always scared that people forget Afghanistan. Because absolutely the first, last year, in the first month when Afghanistan collapsed, okay, Afghanistan was in the top news in all social media, but unfortunately, after the Ukraine war, people are going to forget Afghan situation and Afghan women's situation. But fortunately, or I think fortunately, women's protesting and coming out to the city is the only reason that the people didn't forget Afghanistan still yet. And yeah, it is the only things that people can do it to share some, to speak about the women's situations, and not the women's situation. We should say the human rights situation in Afghanistan, because absolutely the challenging and the problem is not about the women. It is about all humans who live in Afghanistan and unfortunately left behind and abandoned by the international community in August 2021. And I always ask people to speak about Afghanistan and share the news and raise their voices about all challenges that the people are really face in these times in Afghanistan.
And Karim, does going to reporting on the women's situation in Afghanistan, are you ever worried about whether films support or expose contributors to danger?
I mean, contributor safety in general, it's like a massive part of my job, you know, and like every story, every country is very different, but you know, like say a risk assessment, contributor safety would be a major part of that, and I'll spend weeks, months sometimes on you know, a really tight plan. That film in Afghanistan, for example, I mean, okay, there are some people, but really few, maybe like Mahbouba Sharaj, and there's a couple of people who can speak out, but even she's got to be really careful now. It's changed a lot in the past year. Maybe all the women who we interviewed in our film, like, will have to disguise their identity, disguise aspects of their story. First of all, they have to have informed consent. They have to know exactly where the film's going to go. They have to be reminded of that all the time. Because, you know, at first, they can be with you and they're like, yeah, we're going to do it, you know, and they get like caught up in the kind of moment. And you've got to, like, you know, the next day, are you sure? The next day, are you sure? When you're editing it, would send people, like, there's some doctors in a hospital in Herat where there's some surgeons where women, there's a burns unit, which, I mean, it was awful, like, the amount of suicides which were like, rising, and the Taliban were hiding these figures. Anyway, there was some doctors working in that burns unit who were female surgeons, and I think, you know, when they were with us, they wanted to say certain things, but then like months later, we sent them kind of clips. Like, are you sure you can actually say this? And they're like, actually, no, we're going to peel it back. And we even had to censor some of the things that they were saying because we weren't sure that they'd be safe after saying those things. And other women in the film had to, like, you know, not just hide their identities, but like make sure that they weren't seen with us. So would have a very kind of convoluted, even in Kabul, just having a very convoluted plan of like how to get there. You know, like the reporter would go one way in a taxi, I'd go with a bloke on another taxi, then change, and then would rock up at their house at different times. And so, yeah, you have to make a really solid plan, and they have to believe in it as well. It's your biggest fear, you know, like even, yeah, that something happens to a contributor post broadcast. I mean, yeah. You're never totally sure.
Has it happened?
I mean, not in my career. But yeah, I mean, I've heard of loads of horrible stories, of course.
And Mirta, does UNESCO address these issues of support and security? Does it think about these? Because you talk about communication, but of course communication's dangerous.
Yes.
In lots of circumstances.
Yeah.
Yes, UNESCO has championed the United Nations Plan of Action for the Security of Journalists. If you are interested, if you go to UNESCO website, you have a lot of information and updated regularly statistics of how many journalists are being killed while we are living. The problem of security of journalists is also a problem of impunity, because when it is indeed proven that a journalist has been killed or detained illegally, it goes with any kind of punishment or without applying the law in different countries. There's also an issue of security for women bloggers and women journalists, and there is a very interesting report we have published, which is The Chill, it's called. So you can also download from our website. So yes, in general, this is part of the challenges for, or the serious aspects of attacks on freedom of expression and access to information. And many of these cases happen actually in local media, local radio stations, because we are now discussing and mentioning. Hello? Yeah. We are now discussing and mentioning quite tragic and very well spoken cases, but the protection of human rights is needed everywhere. Everywhere. And many times the little reporter or very humble radio station that is just investigating why the river is polluted, ends up discovering that there is a company up the river that is not respecting legislation or is contaminating water and is poisoning, let's say, a large part of the population of the village, and ends up being harassed because the journalist or the reporter just began wondering about the water. When I was producing a publication about gender-related violence against women and girls and how they are reported in the media, which you may also find at UNESCO's website. It's called Reporting on Violence Against Women and Girls. We went and investigated different, very specific gender-related violations of human rights, feticide, forced marriage, child marriage, genital mutilation, domestic violence, trafficking of women, etc., and how the media report on them. And actually remember, do you know the percentage of forced marriages in the UK? Because we have the idea that this happens out there in those dusty countries far away, in underdevelopment. But many of the cases we tackle there are happening even in regions like Europe and North America. Same with genital mutilation. It's not out there in the remote corner of Africa. It's in France. Same with child marriages. It's in Belgium. So that's why we need media. We need media to be able to dig up these cases and investigate and tell us what's happening. Also, when you were talking about the use of the locals for your documentaries, journalists, international journalists, when they go to a country, they don't speak the language, they need what is called the fixer, which is a local reporter or journalist, but otherwise a local person that will drive them, that will take them, that will be the interpreter, and so on. And when we talk about the security or the safety of journalists, the ones that also are suffering from harassment, illegal detentions, destruction of equipment, and death, some of the executions, are the local fixers. The international one is a bit more protected.
And we leave.
You leave.
3 weeks. See you later.
And the local one stays. Same as I was saying before, the local radio is there. It's in the border. It's where the drug traffickers is. For example, in Latin America, it's the one that sees the traffic of uranium or organs, and begins investigating or denouncing or just asking the question on the airwaves of what's happening. So yes, the question of the protection and promotion of human rights, I would say it's something that we can focus on in our everyday life, you know, and sometimes you just begin surprised about something that is happening, and then you end up being the defender of a basic human rights that you notice that is being that is not being respected. Did I answer it?
Thank you very much. Now, we are running a little late, so congratulations, you asked the one question. Fortunately, you asked a very good question, so it got all of us involved. Thank you very much. And thank you all very much for coming. We really do appreciate such a fabulous turnout. Thank you.
One last thing. Thank you, David. Mirta, Paul, Karim, Frank, Fawzia. This was a panel discussion, a very good panel discussion in honour of the memory of David Kato. And I think it's only appropriate to end the evening by handing over to one of David's colleagues from the Centre for Applied Human Rights to give us her reflections on David. And I think also a note from David's family, who unfortunately couldn't be here with us this evening. So I'm going to hand over finally to Joanna Chismas. Joanna.
Thank you. Today, the University of York is humbled to celebrate the legacy of a human rights defender, David Kato. By naming the newest college after David Kato, the university makes a firmer, perhaps, commitment to stand in solidarity with human rights activists. My reflections on David's human rights activism will draw on his very own words. In his application to join the Protective Fellowship Scheme for Human Rights Defenders at Risk at York's Centre for Applied Human Rights, David described his work as follows: bringing up an awareness within the LGBTI community in Uganda of the fundamental human rights that are inherent, and after gaining self-esteem, to get people on board for the struggle for the liberation. Advocating for legal reforms to repeal discriminatory, oppressive laws in the Ugandan constitution reflective of sodomy laws. Following up on human rights violations due to sex orientation and gender identity, documenting harassments, torture, and detentions for future litigation, evacuating suspects or victims of torture to a safe space. This is what Frank is doing. As we can see, David's inspiring activism comprised human rights advocacy and monitoring, as well as protection of victims and survivors of discrimination and human rights violations. This activism represents a struggle for liberation from what Alok Gupta called the strange afterlife of a colonial legacy. As Frank recalled and reminded us beforehand, British colonizers were the ones that had introduced into the penal codes of many countries, including Uganda, sodomy laws that criminalized same-sex relations between consenting adults. After independence, many of these colonial laws were defended as culturally authentic, despite them being essentially alien legacy. Criminalization was in many instances followed by efforts aimed at othering, at invisibilizing or erasing LGBTIQ+ individuals from society. Othering, erasing individuals from society is what we see happens with women in Afghanistan as well. In this context, courageously, indeed bravely, David was, and I quote from his application, seeking to make society aware of the existence of the LGBTI community despite of the policymakers denying our existence. It takes extraordinary courage, it takes bravery to take up space publicly when one's very existence is questioned by powerful state or non-state actors. And it takes empathy and conviction to defend others when faced with threats to one's livelihood and indeed one's life. Human rights defenders are often described as heroes. Recognizing a measure of heroism should not, however, blind us to the need to support human rights defenders and activism. And we should do that systematically, structurally, and institutionally. Civic space around the world, including in the UK, is shrinking. Risks are increasing and complexifying. Universities that enjoy, and admittedly in some parts, in some contexts, only marginally more freedom, stabler structures and resources can and should develop and deepen ties of solidarity with the human rights movement. This does not mean that we in academia in York should speak on behalf or instead of frontline defenders. But what we should do is to acknowledge and leverage the privileges that we have in order to provide support to defenders. And we heard what type of support we can provide. I believe it is in this spirit that the David Kato College was established. It is in the same spirit that I will conclude with a note that was kindly forwarded to us by David Kato's family. I'm citing. It is a decade ago since David Kato was brutally murdered, but there is not much advancement to the cause of eliminating discrimination and the related injustices in the world. Listen to this. The University of York, through Dr. Mary Hayworth, was kind enough to extend an invitation to our family to come and celebrate the recognition of our Tata Kato. After a very rigorous visa application process, and just by a stroke of a pen, we received regrets denying us the possibility of being with you today. One of the statements from this singular decision maker went as follows, and we quote, "Your bank statements reflect your salary credits as the same amount each month, which is unusual, because due to taxation situation, the monthly income can result in minor fluctuations." These decisions, I'm continuing to cite, these decisions cannot even be appealed in any way or form. Are these not the injustices that David Kato was fighting to eliminate? As a family, we join you to celebrate the recognition bestowed on David. We hope that this will act as a symbol for promoting peace around the world. We thank you, the family of the late David Kato, and I thank you too.
What an extraordinary coda that was to this story. Let me try and move beyond UK immigration policy to think of something a bit more uplifting. And that is that there are 800 students in the David Kato College, and next year there'll be 800 more, and after that, and after that, and after that. And I hope those students will, over those generations, be not just inspired by the courage that David Kato showed, but also that they will, through that example, stand up for those facing repression and discrimination, and also be unashamedly themselves. And with those thoughts, I now invite you to join us out in the atrium, if you have the time, for a glass of wine and, amongst other things, the unveiling of the plaque that will sit in the David Kato College. So please join me in a final round of applause for our panel, for Joanna, and then join us outside for a drink.